Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of Riskologists. As always, I'm your host Pat Bradshaw, and today absolutely delighted to be joined by Graeme Miller. So Graeme, thanks very much for coming on.
Hi Pat, thanks for having me on.
No worries at all. No worries at all. We made it at last. I think it's becoming a common theme across the first series that from the time we initially planned to record compared to the actual recording is normally months apart. So yeah, no, I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no problem at all. That's a pleasure.
No worries. How is your podcast game? Have you done anything like this before, or do you listen to podcasts even?
Yeah, I listen to podcasts a lot actually. I've done comparable things in the past, so I've been involved with IRM special interest groups, presented to a couple of those, so that's quite similar. Also used to be a drummer in bands when I was younger, so I did quite a lot of recording in that kind of past life.
Nice. Yeah, I think when we were sort of preparing for the episode, sort of realised we're both keen but potentially unaccomplished musicians. I'm the same. I've played guitar since I was probably about 8 or 9 or something. It's one of those love-hate relationships, like you say. Sometimes you pick it up every day for 6 months, and then it'll go 12 months without even looking at it. But yeah,
this is it. Yeah. Well, I've been drumming since I was 6 years old, but more recently, kind of guitar and stuff. But yeah, a lot of fun.
Nice. I honestly don't think I would have made it out of my parents' house alive if I'd taken up drumming. But excellent, digress. But like I said, Graeme, thanks a lot for coming on, mate. Really appreciate it. But as we always do with these things, I think a really great place to start is a little bit of a journey to date, really. So obviously how you got into the profession, a little bit of a introduction to that, a bit of a highlight reel of what you've accomplished and obviously your career path over the years and up to the point recording this podcast right now. So yeah, fire away.
Okay, yeah. So I started off studying law. I really enjoyed it. There weren't many opportunities for traineeships at the time, so this was in the kind of aftermath of the financial crisis. And also, I didn't want to limit myself to living and practicing law solely in Scotland. So I started looking around for alternative career paths, and something that kept coming up was risk management. So I undertook a master's degree in risk management at Glasgow Caledonian University. Managed to achieve a distinction.
Nice.
Cheers. I think there was a lot of credit owed to Don Anderson, who was my dissertation tutor at the time. But yeah, really pleased to get that. So started my risk career with Mott MacDonald's in London. So that was a pretty big move from Glasgow to London. And I was put on a major portfolio of National Grid's high voltage electricity projects. So that was about 3.5 billion. Wow. So I started off as a risk analyst, kind of learning the ropes, and pretty quickly, within about 18 months or so, I graduated through the ranks and became the head of risk on that portfolio. So as part of that role, I did with Mott MacDonald's some enterprise risk management, some business continuity management, and I also undertook the IRM's international diploma during my time there. And while I was there also, my efforts were rewarded with the IRM's Global Newcomer of the Awards. So that was back in 2015.
Nice.
And yeah, cheers. It was a really good event. Actually, it was Joanna Lumley who presented the awards. It was a great night.
Shout out Joanna if she's listening. Yeah. I highly doubt it.
I doubt it, but yeah, it's nice to think. So yeah, after I left Mott MacDonald shortly after that, started working with Arcadis and got involved with some really interesting projects. So Crossrail 2, HS2, a host of TfL station upgrade projects. And then I became a contractor shortly after that. Well, I'd say shortly, maybe 3-4 years later. And did some kind of independent work. So I was working with Tideway and HS2 as well. So I'm currently the risk lead on the Euston Station project. I became a fellow of the Institute of Risk Management. That was maybe a year or so ago. And I've become heavily involved with the risk management special interest group. So most involved with the risk complexity special interest group. And over the last 18 months or so, I've pulled together a team of really talented tech guys, software developers, and we're working on building a new risk management software. So nice. It's all exciting times.
Nice, love that. Yeah, I think you mentioned a couple of times about the IRM SIG. I think that was actually where you actually first came on my radar. I think I sat in on a talk that you did that I found really interesting. So when I was sort of looking at people who might be useful to come on, you were sort of right at the top of the list.
Oh, good stuff. That's nice to hear.
No worries. So just out of interest in terms of just going back to your law degree, I also did law at uni, and I've not made it much of a secret. I think I might have mentioned on previous episodes actually that I'd never wanted to be a lawyer. I got to the end of my A levels, and I guess I was good at business, science, English, and it seemed like a good degree to do.
Yeah.
Were you in a similar position, or I know you obviously risk management came later, and it was sort of potentially stumbled across it. What was the plan for yourself, Graeme? Was law something like a stepping stone similar to me, or did you initially plan on going into that profession?
Well, yeah, I was really interested in law. It's a fascinating subject.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed studying it, and I think at the beginning I was all about becoming a lawyer, and then as time kind of moved on and I get more of a feel for what the job itself would be like, I started to become less and less enchanted by it. And then yeah, the kind of final nail in the coffin was finishing the degree, and there not been many traineeships available, and I just thought I think it's time for a change. Let's see what else is out there.
Yeah, fair enough. I was the same. Obviously, completed the 3 years, and then you've got to go on and do an LPC, which instead of going directly into that, I went traveling for a couple of years. I think I've mentioned came back when I sort of landed back on home soil. It was like I don't think law is going to be my vocation.
And the thing is, with law as well, it's obviously constantly evolving. So
exactly,
what you learn is not necessarily or it's definitely not what's in practice now.
Exactly, and also how have you sort of found, or how you adapted, I should say, to life down in London as a Glaswegian? Have you did you struggle at first, or was it pretty? Do you much prefer the big city?
Oh, I definitely prefer it. I mean, it was a big culture shock, definitely. So the pace of life down here is just chalk and cheese. But yeah, I really enjoy it. So I kind of miss London when I go back to Glasgow. I enjoy being there for a few days, seeing everybody, but I start to miss it again. So it's definitely home now.
Love that. Yeah, I've sort of got a love-hate relationship with London. Apologies to anyone listening who's based down in London. I think I really enjoy it for sort of short stints, but I think being a northerner, after a few days, I just find it a little bit too hectic. Like you say, maybe I just need to grit and bear it, and I'll probably be the same. I'd probably love it as well. Excellent. Well, digress, but thanks for that, Graeme. I really appreciate it. As I always say, I think it's really interesting to hear of people's backgrounds and see what their journey's been up to this point. But as everyone will have seen, I'm sure from the title of the episode, today we're going to be talking about risk complexity. So I'm aware, as I'm sure most of our listeners are, easy for me to say, that there is some ambiguity when it comes to the differentiating between complex systems and complicated systems. So really looking forward to getting stuck into that today. But out of interest, Graeme, why did you opt to choose this topic to discuss?
So complexity generally is a really interesting subject, and I've been interested in it for quite a while. So I've read quite a lot of books and various different resources, listened to podcasts and what have you. So when I noticed there was a risk complexity special interest group for the IRM, I got involved in that with Mike Bartlett and others. And we contributed a chapter on risk complexity for the APM's PRAM guide, which is coming out, I think, later this year. All the final chapters have been submitted, as far as I know, so it should be soon. But yeah, I got into the subject of risk complexity, and as part of that, we realised that it's a subject that really has to be promoted in risk management. We really need to start taking account of the complexity of risk. And I mean, you've heard of risk being managed in silos, and that still goes on. So we need to think about how it connects to other elements within major projects or wider organisations.
Love that. Yeah, no, I think, like you say, it's a really pertinent topic to discuss, and nobody else actually raised it to discuss. I think there was a little bit of competition in the early days for people to be able to talk about risk culture, which I think is always going to be the sort of the hot topic out of the blocks that everyone wants to speak about. But so yeah, when you mentioned risk complexity, I was I was really excited to discuss that. And interesting, you should mention Mike as well, Mike Bartlett. I've actually spoken to Mike previously. We were hoping to sort of get him involved in season 1, but just the way things panned out, he's probably looking more to be in a later season. But yeah, no, he's a really great guy and had some really interesting thoughts and for topics as well. So yeah, looking forward to that. But cheers, Graeme. So as we always do on the podcast, we'll start simple. So would you mind explaining what you mean by complexity?
Okay, so complexity can be described as the way that large numbers of individual entities interact with one another within an individual and single system according to a specific set of rules or general principles. So the dynamics of a complex system generally emerge from the interaction of the entities within it. And because of this, complex systems are not predictable in the same way that simpler systems are. So in terms of a kind of bullet point definition, then it's a system which contains multiple parts, stakeholders and requirements. It possesses a large number of connections and exhibits dynamic interactions between the parts. And it produces behavior as a result of those interactions, which cannot be explained as a simple sum of its parts. So that's referred to as emergent behavior, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So it's probably useful at this point actually to talk about the history and the development of complexity theory. So it all started back in the late 1940s with a guy called Ilya Prigogine. So he was a chemist, he was working in Brussels, and he was carrying out research into thermodynamics, which is the relationships between heat and other forms of energy. So he went on to win the Nobel Prize for this in 1977. But based on his findings and in an apparent divergence from his usual area of expertise, he wrote a book about traffic management, which is called The Kinetic Theory of Vehicular Traffic. So the shift of focus was because he discovered that it's possible to create order out of chaos. And he wrote a further book by that title to show that his prior findings relate not just to chemical reactions in traffic, but to many different phenomena in the wider world. So this gave rise to the field of study which is known as complex system science, and it emerged as its own discipline around about 50 years ago. And it's applied in a wide variety of areas, ranging from the economy to social political issues and the natural world. So a good example of a complex system that we're all really familiar with by now is pandemic, where complexity theory and modelling has played a key part in its management. So the interactions between people are how the disease spreads. So the better you can understand these interactions, the better placed you are to manage the pandemic as a whole. So for our purposes, we'll focus on complex projects, I think.
Nice, no, that's really interesting. Thanks, Graeme. And straightforward enough, I guess. But what do we mean by complexity risk then in the context of risk management?
Okay, so simply put, it's the type of risk which arises from and is unique to complex systems. So when you've got a large volume of unique or dynamic components all interacting with one another in unique and dynamic environments, it's far more difficult to determine the causes and effects. And this is where complexity risk can start to materialize. So these complexity risks are more challenging to identify, quantify, model, and manage than the ones you might be familiar with on simpler projects or in simpler systems. And as such, they require a different way of thinking to fully appreciate and manage them.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. So in terms of obviously understanding complexity, then why is that important in the context of risk management?
So it's really important to understand complexity in risk management because the greater the level of complexity, the greater the level of uncertainty and therefore risk. Effectively, if you have more factors at play, you've got more ways in which things can go wrong. And because of this, when you're dealing with a complex system, you need to put additional controls in place. So this is so as you can get a handle on the size and the nature of the problem that you're dealing with, and also to target your efforts in the right direction. So if you don't understand the extent and the structure of your risk profile, you're less likely to know where your key sources of risk are. And you could find yourself constantly firefighting their impacts. So of course, the consequence of that is that you're hemorrhaging resources in terms of time and money.
Yeah, no, of course. So in terms of actually Not looking at risk management, then we obviously touch on that in a second. In terms of factors you would need to consider when identifying complex systems and projects, what sort of factors would you need to consider?
Okay, so first of all, you need to establish which of your projects have inherent complexity. So if you're on a portfolio of projects, you need to identify the ones that are most complex and then gain an understanding as to the levels of complexity that are present there. So it's useful to consider projects as being on a continuum ranging from highly predictable to highly unpredictable. This helps to distinguish between complicated and complex projects, identify potential risks, and select the most appropriate leadership style and control framework for delivering the project. So there are some really simple tried and tested techniques that you can use to establish what type of project you're working on before you start to identify, assess, analyse, and develop appropriate strategies. One that you're probably familiar with is the PESTLE technique. So that's political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal factors. Yes. So these are all categories that you can brainstorm within and consider, and you're getting a pretty broad net when you look at those. Then you've got SWOT analysis. So again, a really familiar one: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But I think my favourite in this kind of field is Eddie Obeng's 4 types of project. So dead simple approach, 4 different types of project as the name suggests. The first of which is painting by numbers. So this is where the project and its stakeholders know what needs to be done and how it's to be delivered. So the level of uncertainty there is low. Risks are really easy to identify, and they're all within manageable limits. So the next one then would be going on a quest. And this is where the project and its stakeholders know what needs to be delivered, but they're unsure as to how to deliver it. So this type of project requires some more exploration of the way to achieve your project's objectives. And the next one is making a movie. So that's where the project and its stakeholders know how to deliver the project, but are unsure of what needs to be delivered. So this type of project requires analysis and more definition of requirements. And then the final one, which is the most aligned to our definition of complexity, is walking in fog. So this is where the project and its stakeholders know that the project is necessary, but they don't know how to scope it or how to deliver it. And this is most likely to exhibit the characteristics of complexity, as I say, and therefore require additional measures to manage the associated risk. So by establishing where the complexity resides in your project, you're much better placed to start identifying the risks.
No, that's really interesting. What did you say that gent's name was? Sorry, Graeme. Was it Eddie Obeng? Sorry.
Eddie Obeng, yes.
Eddie Obeng. Oh, interesting. I've not come across that before. I'll put it in the podcast notes for anybody.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it before kind of doing this research either. But yeah, it's been around for a while. I think it was the kind of mid-90s that he came up with this approach. But yeah, definitely really useful.
Interesting. No, I love that. Love that. Thanks, Graeme. So in terms of obviously assessing and analysing and responding to complexity risks, both threats and opportunities, how would you then go about that? Is it a similar process that we're used to, or is it slightly different?
So yeah, we use the same general broad strokes, but we're enhancing the processes. So as I mentioned, I recently worked with Mike Bartlett to contribute a chapter to the upcoming APM Pram Guide on risk complexity. And in the chapter, we define key areas for consideration in the identification of complex risks and provide a list of questions to consider in each area. So these are volume, uniqueness of components, uniqueness of environment, novelty of projects, team capacity, capability, and stakeholders. So we include some really easy questions to get you started in identifying complexity risks on your project. So that's the identify component of it. So when you're assessing complexity risks, you need to be especially mindful of human factors. So the way that people interact with each other and with the systems around them. The questions that you want to consider are: what judgments are they making and how reliable are they? So what access to information do they have? What cognitive limitations are there? And what timeframes for making decisions are in place? Then you want to consider what factors are influencing the decisions. So consider the unconscious biases that we're familiar with. So optimism bias, confirmation bias, and anchoring. How do we apply more rigor to the process? So highlighting key areas where human subjectivity and analysing human judgment can help to increase confidence in the assessments and create more uniformity as to the assessments that you're landing on.
Great stuff. Cheers, Graeme. So as I alluded to earlier in the episode, I think there is some ambiguity when it comes to differentiating between complex and complicated systems, for example. So could you please walk us through these characteristics and how they differ?
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of confusion around the terms. I mean, they're new terms, and some of the sources are actually kind of contradictory as well. So I'll do my best. A simple system or project is characterized by stability, and there are clear cause and effect relationships there. So they're largely predictable and controllable as a result, and they've most likely been delivered many times before, and there's really well established best practice. So whilst there will always be variation in delivering a project, it's usually within parameters that are easily foreseen and managed. So if you think of a family home construction project, they've been delivered a million times before. It's an experienced contracting firm, and they know everything they're likely to encounter. So if anything does kind of come out of the blue, it's usually manageable.
Yeah.
So that's a simple project. Talking about complicated project next then. So there are three components of a complicated system or project: that they are designed, predicted, and controllable. So if you think of a jet engine as an example, there are many different parts interacting with one another and working together. But a jet engine is designed, the outputs are consistent, and they're always predictable, or you would hope at least, and the system can therefore be controlled. That's not the case with a complex system or project. So these are systems which evolve and are characterized by multiple connections between entities with a degree of interdependency. So these give rise to unforeseen emergent behavior and feedback loops. And whilst these systems are ultimately tractable through structured analysis, they can quickly spiral out of control if the complexity isn't fully recognized and addressed proportionately.
Yeah.
So I'll give a little bit of an explanation then. I mentioned a couple of terms there, emergent behavior and feedback loops. So emergent behavior, this is where interacting interdependent entities in a complex system create new order or new structure or a new way of working. So they adapt and they react to changing circumstances in order to survive, and are therefore creating continually new normals. So if you think about developing a new car, there are unknown qualities about that, which can't be addressed until you've reached a certain point in the project. So if you think of the comfort of the ride, for example, you're not going to know that with any great degree of certainty until you've actually test driven one of the cars. So then you've got feedback loops. There are two different types of feedback loop. You've got positive and negative. So looking at positive first, if you think about a network of people, if person A starts a rumor and tells person B, who then goes on to tell person C and person D, and then it comes back around to person A, that will confirm to an extent to person A that the rumor was true, when in fact the rumor was false. So that's a positive feedback loop example. An example of a negative feedback loop is a central heating system. So the temperature will drop below the accepted or the desired temperature. And when this is fed back to the system, an action's taken to re-establish the right temperature. So you can imagine then in a complex project, if these loops of information are continuously happening and generating new norms, then it can create a very, very complex infrastructure that has to be managed. So that's complex systems. If we move on to chaotic systems now, so these are projects where the relationships between cause and effect are impossible to determine. And this is because they shift continuously and there aren't any identifiable patterns. So the only constant in a chaotic system really is change itself. A fundamental aspect of these projects is the inherent unknowable and therefore unmanageable nature of them. And current analytical techniques aren't sophisticated enough yet to fully appreciate chaotic systems. So the main determinant chaos system is sensitivity to initial conditions. So a really good example that people will be familiar with, I'm sure, is that of the mathematician and meteorologist Edward Lorenz, and that's the butterfly effect. So interestingly, it was when he first posited the idea, it was the seagull effect, but I think somebody gave him some advice that butterfly effect's a little bit more poetic, so I think he ran with that.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree.
Yeah, oh, it definitely is. So the idea is that a butterfly flapping its wings in one place could ultimately lead to a tornado somewhere else. And this is a great example of changing initial conditions resulting in different outcomes. So if you think again of another example, if you roll a couple of dice and you've got a double six position, it's likely to give you a different outcome than if you roll the dice from a double three position. So slight changes, very slight changes in some cases, can cascade and snowball into catastrophic events. And that's where you really need to be mindful and make sure that you've bolstered your risk management processes to deal with it.
Amazing. No, that's really interesting. Thanks, Graeme. So just a question that I've noted down on obviously some of the things you've mentioned earlier. So just touching back on simple, complicated, complex and chaotic systems then. So does the process in selecting a suitable option under the NEC suite correlate in any way to how the complexity of your system is identified or vice versa? So for example, option A, where there's a great deal of, I beg your pardon, there's a great degree of confidence in the scope, would arguably be highly predictable or simple in inverted commas versus an option C where the scope isn't as clearly defined, so it's complicated or complex. Hopefully that question makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, there's definitely value in using your assessment of complexity in your selection of the contract that's most appropriate for the project. So if you've already done what we've talked about in using Obeng's 4 types of project, for example, you've got an understanding of the levels of complexity that you're dealing with, and then you're in a much better position to select the appropriate contract type.
Excellent. So that leads us on nicely to analysing complexity risk.
Yeah, so the study of complexity has developed hand in hand with the increase in computer power. So it means then that we're more able now to map complex systems and model the associated risk and generate meaningful results. So the key to understanding this is the location and the nature of connections between risks and other modelled entities. So if you think about a pandemic again, the disease thrives through the connections between people, but these connections aren't necessarily all the same, and some are potentially bidirectional. So this is vital to recognise, especially given that standard project risk management tools only consider simple linear interactions. So often the logic entered into a schedule risk analysis tool is the absolute minimum to generate a critical path. Risks are generally considered as discrete events and unrelated to other risks. So causes and consequences are difficult to model, and current risk analysis tools don't really appreciate the potential for more than one cause and more than one consequence. So then the advice is, as a minimum, if you're trying to model complexity, you need to take account of correlation between complexity risks. So correlation, it can be described as the relationship between two or more variables. And this can be broken down into 2 types. So the existence of risk, that's where if a risk occurs or changes in likelihood, then another related risk might be more likely to occur or change in likelihood. And then the second, the impact of risks. And this is where the impact of one risk is related to the impact of another. Once you've identified all your complexity risks and you've assessed them sufficiently, you want to develop mitigation strategies. So this is where we get to the respond phase. So the management of complexity risk requires the additional measures outlined previously to ensure that it's fully appreciated and adequately controlled. So in addition to the enhanced modelling techniques that we've already talked about, the response to complexity risk needs to enhance traditional risk management techniques. And this is to recognise that solutions need to take account of risk cultures, of human behaviour, and of identified trends. So as part of any risk management framework that's designed to take account of complexity risk, any risks which are identified which stem specifically from complexity should be emphasised in risk reporting. It should be recognise that the effects of complexity risk are likely to be greater than any single party's accountability or liability. So a collaborative risk management response is required. So we're talking there about contractual liability for risks. When you look at the complexity and the interdependency of risks, that line between contractor and client, for example, is often blurred. So look out for early warning signs for the commencement of any ripple effects that should be established with proactive and reactive response actions defined in advance. And a final point then, the primary purpose of managing complexity risk is to avoid the project moving into a crisis phase. So whilst we want to avoid that as far as possible, risk management techniques used in crisis management can be really valuable in managing complexity risk. So as you might imagine, there are different managerial responses required depending on whether you're looking at risk on a simple project, a complex project, or a chaotic systems or projects. So with a simple project, it's pretty straightforward. You've done these types of projects before. So you've got access to fact-based management techniques. You can use real data, live data in some instances. There's well-established best practice, so you just need to make sure that that's in place and you shouldn't go too far wrong. You can delegate authority without too much complication. And you're able to communicate clearly in direct ways. So keeping it simple is the key on a simple project. When you get into complex projects, you want to create focus groups. So listen to conflicting advice and assess each response uniformly. Make sure that you're considering the sources of your information before acting upon it. So you want to cultivate creative environments and carry out experiments which allow patterns to emerge. Use methods that can help generate ideas and ensure that all ideas are captured so as you can cherry pick the best and help them drive your project forward. Okay, so then we move on to chaotic systems or projects. So when managing risk in a chaotic system or project, you want to record and repeat approaches that work. Take immediate action to re-establish order after a significant change has happened. So as we spoke about earlier, establishing a new normal. Provide clear, direct communication. So if you think crisis communication, there's a lot of crossover between managing risk in a chaotic environment and managing risk in a crisis. A useful technique to use is to compartmentalize and split off chaotic components from the main project.
Yeah.
So if you're dealing with a complex project, but there's a chaotic element to it, if you box that off and deal with it separately, you can contain that to a large extent. So if you think, for example, then of trying out a new technology or technique, you might not want that impacting on the wider project if it doesn't go entirely to plan.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Graeme. So as a final point, just to wrap things up then, I guess, what's next when it comes to tackling risk complexity? So where are we currently and how do you see techniques and tools improving in the profession moving forward?
So as part of the Pram Guide chapter that I spoke about earlier, we carried out an assessment of the tools available to manage risk on complex projects. It became apparent that current risk analysis tools fall short of the standard that's going to be required. So there's therefore an imminent need for more sophisticated tools and techniques to ensure that complexity is fully appreciated and that it's adequately managed.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Graeme. I really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed this topic. Like I say, I think it's something is extremely pertinent, and to have somebody come on who's as passionate about it as you is brilliant. So thank you for that. But excellent. Just as I always do, and as a bit of a tradition on the Riskologist podcast, if you could give yourself a piece of advice that you know now that you didn't know at the start of your career, what would that piece of advice be?
Probably just a simple thing. So it's proved itself time and again that half the battle of tackling something big is to be organised. So if you approach it in a methodical and logical way, develop a process, and everything will become much easier. So it's like the old expression, how do you eat an elephant? One mouthful at a time. Yeah, I think that proves itself over and over. Not that I'm eating of elephants.
No, it's so interesting. I know that sort of old adage is just a bit playful at the end, but the amount of guests I've had on the podcast who have said everything in bite-sized chunks, everything, like you say, one mouthful at a
Oh,
time.
really?
And yeah, my mentor Paul Sutcliffe is probably he uses the phrase constantly with me, just getting things down, breaking things down into bite-sized chunks. So no, I think a lot of people share that piece of wisdom with you. But no, that's brilliant. Cheers, Graeme. And then last point. So in terms of getting in touch, so if anybody's listened today and would like to get in touch with you to sort of pick your brains on anything risk complexity or any of the points you've made in the podcast, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
I think through LinkedIn is probably the best way. So yeah, I would welcome anybody getting in touch, definitely.
Great stuff. No problem. I'll certainly put a link to Graeme's LinkedIn profile in the podcast notes if anybody wants to go directly through to that. But lastly, Graeme, I know it's something that you mentioned quite early on in the podcast, that you've been working on some interesting things behind the scenes and extracurricular. So did you want to give us a little bit of an insight on that briefly?
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty exciting, actually. So I've pulled together a team of really talented software developers, and we're building a next generation risk management software solution, which takes account of complexity, interdependency, the subjectivity of risk. So yeah, we're progressing through the build schedule at pace now, and we'll be presenting it to the risk community really soon.
Amazing. Excited to see that, as I'm sure everybody else is. But like I said, Graeme, really do appreciate you coming on today, mate. It's been a long time coming, but we got there in the end. But like I said, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers, Pat.
No worries, Graeme. Thanks, mate. Take it easy.